Hey, I'm Aaron Bernstein. By now, you should be familiar with the 4 different types of triad: major, minor, augmented, and diminished. But triads are really just the beginning. They're the simplest type of chord that we have in tonal music. They're based on 2/3 stacked on top of each other, but you could put another third on top of that and you get what's called a 7th chord. And that's going to really expand our harmonic vocabulary. So let's begin. As you know, a triad is made from 2/3, one stacked on top of the other. If your triad is in root position, with the root in the bass, then you have a third above the root and a fifth above the root. Now, if we stack another third on top of this triad, we get a 7th above the root, and that's why this is called a 7th chord. As you can hear, that interval of the 7th gives the chord a dissonance you don't get with triads. So 7th chords are tense and unstable and provide more tone color than bare triads. Before we continue, there are some intervals we'll want to be really solid on: the major third, 4 half steps, and the minor third, 3 half steps. These, of course, are the intervals that make triads, so be thoroughly familiar with your 4 triads: major, minor, augmented, and diminished. Also know your 7ths. There are 3 7ths we'll be using: the major 7th, which is a half step smaller than the octave, the minor 7th, a half step smaller than that, and the diminished 7th, yet a half step smaller. Make sure you can form these intervals above any starting pitch. Alright, think of 7th chords as having 2 parts, a triad on the bottom and a 7th on top. And because you can have any kind of triad or 7th, that gives you a lot of possibilities. So let's make A the root, and I'll show you all the 7th chords you can build on A. Let's start with a major triad, and we'll put a major 7th on top. This is the major 7th chord. Major triad, major 7th. Listen to the clashing dissonance. Next, let's keep the major triad, but now we put a minor 7th on top. This is the dominant 7th chord. Major triad, minor 7th. We call it the dominant 7th because it's the chord built on the 5th note of any major scale, the dominant. So this A dominant 7th chord functions as the 5 chord in D major and has a strong tendency back to 1. Moving right along, let's have a minor triad and keep the minor 7th on top. This is the minor 7th chord. Minor triad, minor 7th. Arguably the mellowest of the 7th chords. Next, keep the minor 7th on top again, but change to a diminished triad. This is the half diminished 7th chord. Diminished triad, minor 7th. Now you jazz cats know this chord is the minor 7 flat 5, but in classical music it's called half diminished. Very poignant, even anguished sounding. One more, keep that diminished triad, and now we put a diminished 7th on top. Now we have the diminished 7th chord. Diminished triad, diminished 7th. This is the most tense, angry, and ambiguous of the 7th chords. It's also symmetrical. Every third in this chord is a minor third. This makes the diminished 7th a useful chord for modulation, or a key change. We'll take a closer look at this useful chord in future lessons. Okay, these are the 7th chords you're most likely to see in classical music. The major 7th, dominant 7th, minor 7th, half diminished 7th, and diminished 7th. But you'll find them just as often in jazz and pop, plus a few more. There are 3 other 7th chords typically seen in jazz. We have the minor major 7th, which is exactly what it sounds like: a minor triad and a major 7th on top. Finally, we have 2 augmented 7th chords: the augmented major 7th chord, augmented triad, major 7th, and just the plain augmented 7th chord. Augmented triad, minor 7th. Now, one last word about 7th chords. They need to be spelled out in thirds, just like triads. If you look at our last example, the augmented 7th chord, the root is A, and we have to spell the chord by skipping letter names. A, C, E, and G. That's why it's E sharp. We can't call it F. Let's try another one. If we want to build a C diminished 7th chord, our letter names have to be C, E, G, and B. That way we have all thirds. Now, every third in a diminished 7th chord is a minor third, so our notes are C, E flat, G flat, and then another minor third up to B double flat. We can't call it A because G flat up to A isn't a third. One final example, here's a B major 7th chord. Major triad, major 7th. Let's turn this into a major augmented 7th chord. Well, we keep the major 7th on top, but we change to an augmented triad down below. Our 5th has to be raised a half step. That's F sharp raised up to F double sharp. That's the only way to spell this chord out in thirds. B, D sharp, F double sharp, and A sharp. Well done. If you can do that, you can do anything. So now what you want to do is take a look at the worksheets for 7th chords and get some really good practice at building all these different types of 7th chord on any given note. And just remember that a 7th chord is really just a triad on the bottom and a 7th on top of it. So there's only 4 different types of triad: major, minor, augmented, and diminished. And then on top you could either have a major 7th, a minor 7th, or a diminished 7th. One last thing, be sure you listen to the 7th chord audio files, because recognizing what each of these chords sounds like is just as important as being able to make them on the page. All right, we're done. I'm Aaron Bernstein, and go have fun.